All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're diving deep into the Syrian conflict, and you've brought along a fascinating source in Arabic.
It really offers a unique perspective, especially from the ground level. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical maneuvering, but this source brings us back to the human impact.
Absolutely. And one thing that jumped out at me was the stark contrast it paints between North and South Syria.
Right, the north is, well, utter chaos, a real battleground. But in the south, there was actually a period of relative peace between some rebel groups and the Assad regime. It really highlights the complexity of this conflict.
It almost sounds like two different wars happening within one country. Can you talk a bit more about that agreement in the South? How did it even come about?
Well, it was a combination of factors, really. Exhaustion on both sides, for one, but also a recognition that neither could achieve a decisive victory. So they struck this deal. It wasn't perfect, but it offered a glimpse of what a negotiated settlement could look like, at least in certain areas.
The source mentions specific terms, like residents being allowed to stay in their homes, detainees being released. The Syrian army even agreed to stay out of some rebel-held zones.
Exactly. It wasn't just a ceasefire. It was a genuine attempt to restore some normalcy. For many Syrians, that's all they really wanted, to live their lives without the constant fear of violence.
It's a powerful reminder that while we often talk about this conflict in terms of grand narratives, regime change, proxy wars, all that, for many Syrians, it was about survival, about protecting their families and communities.
Absolutely. And it makes the breakdown of that agreement all the more tragic. You see, as rebel groups in the north started gaining ground, capturing cities like Aleppo and Hama, it emboldened some factions. The fragile peace in the south began to unravel.
I'm guessing that's where Israel comes into the picture. The source hints that they saw an opportunity in all this chaos.
This is where things get really interesting. You see, Israel has always been wary of Syrian instability, especially near the Golan Heights, which, as you know, they captured from Syria back in '67.
Right, so they're concerned about Syrian rebels operating near the Golan Heights. That makes sense on the surface.
But the source suggests there's a deeper game at play. Israel's real concern is Iran.
Iran.
Yeah, they see the growing presence of Iranian-backed forces in Syria as a direct threat, a red line. And they're using the instability, the rebel activity, as justification to push back against them.
So are you saying they're not really worried about the rebels themselves? They're using that as a pretext to go after Iran?
The source certainly suggests that.
Yeah.
They point to this really interesting example. Israel, even though they officially oppose Assad, they actually help facilitate the transfer of apples from Syria to Jordan through the occupied Golan Heights.
Apples? What do apples have to do with anything?
It seems like a bizarre move, right? But the source interprets it as a signal to Assad, a way of saying, look, we're willing to tolerate your regime, even help you out economically, as long as you keep those Iranian forces in check.
So it's not about supporting or opposing Assad. It's about manipulating the situation to achieve their strategic objectives, which in this case is containing Iran.
Exactly. And it highlights a key theme that runs throughout the source. This idea that everyone involved in the Syrian conflict is playing their own game, pursuing their own interests, often at the expense of the Syrian people.
And it's not just Israel, right? The source also delves into Turkey's involvement, especially their support for certain rebel groups in the north.
Yeah, Turkey's always had a complicated relationship with Syria, and the conflict has given them an opportunity to assert themselves. They've been supporting various rebel groups, but their main goal seems to be establishing control over parts of northern Syria.
And it's not just about security, is it? There's also a significant Kurdish population in that region.
Right, and Turkey views the Kurds as a threat. They've long been trying to suppress Kurdish autonomy, both within their own borders and in neighboring countries. The source even describes an incident where Turkey, under the guise of fighting terrorism, launched airstrikes against Kurdish-led forces who are actually allied with the U.S. in the fight against ISIS.
Wow. So we've got Israel maneuvering to counter Iran, Turkey trying to control the Kurds. It's a tangled web of alliances and betrayals. And in the middle of it all are the Syrian people caught in the crossfire.
It's a tragic situation, and it underscores the complexity of this conflict. There's no easy good guys and bad guys here, just competing interests and a lot of suffering.
And we haven't even talked about Russia yet. They've been Assad's staunchest ally, right?
Yeah.
Providing him with the military support he needed to stay in power.
Yeah, Russia's been a key player in this whole saga. But even their commitment seems to be wavering, according to the source. They're talking about scaling back their support.
Really? That's surprising. Why would they do that now? Are they just tired of propping up Assad?
It's probably a combination of factors. The war in Ukraine has certainly strained their resources. Plus, there are rumors that even within the Kremlin, there's growing frustration with Assad's unwillingness to compromise.
So even Russia, Assad's longtime backer, is starting to have second thoughts.
It seems so. And that raises a lot of questions about what happens next. If Assad loses Russia's full support, who fills that vacuum? And what does it mean for the future of Syria?
All fascinating questions, and I'm sure we'll dive into those and more after a quick...
Oh, actually, we don't have a break today. We're just going to keep going. There's so much more to discuss.
All right, then, let's keep this deep dive going. Buckle up, folks, because this is where things get really interesting.
Before we get to Russia and what happens next, I want to circle back to something we were discussing earlier. The Syrian army, they've been retreating in a, well, kind of unusual way, leaving behind weapons and equipment. Even valuable stuff, Russian-made systems.
Right, I remember that detail from the source. It seemed odd. I mean, usually when an army's losing, they try to salvage what they can, right?
Exactly. So what's going on here? The source suggests a couple of possibilities. One is that Assad's doing this deliberately.
Deliberately? You mean he's intentionally leaving weapons behind?
It sounds crazy, but yeah, that's one theory. He could be trying to arm rebel groups, maybe even with weapons that could target Russian forces. It's a way to, sort of pressure Russia to stay involved, to keep backing him up.
So it's a high-stakes gamble. Is there any indication that Assad would actually do something like that? Risk provoking his main ally?
It's risky, for sure. But the source does highlight how Assad has used similar tactics in the past, playing different groups against each other to stay in power. Remember the Apple exports we talked about? Helping Assad economically while also trying to contain Iranian influence. It's all part of this, well, kind of Machiavellian approach to staying in power.
Survival at all costs, even if it means further destabilizing the country.
It seems that way. And it gets to this core idea that keeps coming up in the source. Syria is like this cake that everyone wants a piece of, but nobody wants to deal with the mess it's become.
A cake? That's a pretty vivid analogy.
It's stuck with me too. And it makes sense, right? You've got all these external players, Israel, Turkey, Russia, Iran, all with their own interests, all trying to carve out their own sphere of influence. And in the middle of it all are the Syrian people, the ones who actually have to live with the consequences.
So let's break that down a bit. We talked about Israel using the conflict to contain Iran. What about Turkey? What are they getting out of this?
Well, we touched on it earlier. Turkey's main focus is the Kurds. They view Kurdish autonomy as a threat, both inside Turkey and in neighboring countries like Syria. The chaos of the civil war has given them an opportunity to move into northern Syria, establish a military presence. They claim it's about fighting terrorism. But the source points out that they've also targeted Kurdish groups that were allied with the U.S. in the fight against ISIS.
So it's all about leveraging the chaos to advance their own interests.
Pretty much. And, it's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess game, but we can't lose sight of the human cost of all this. The source doesn't shy away from that. It talks about the devastation, the millions of people displaced, the shattered lives.
It's a sobering reminder of what's really at stake here.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the prospects for peace. The source mentions these upcoming talks in Doha between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. They're trying to revive the Assad agreement, that ceasefire deal from a few years back.
Do you think there's any chance that could work? I mean, given everything we've just discussed, everyone with their own agenda, the changing dynamics on the ground.
I'm skeptical, to be honest. The situation's changed a lot since 2017 when that agreement was signed. Turkey's now got a foothold in northern Syria. Israel's actively working to undermine Iranian influence. It's hard to see how those three countries can come to any kind of lasting agreement, especially with Russia potentially reducing their support for Assad.
Right, we were talking about that earlier. Even Russia's commitment seems to be wavering.
It's a big shift, and it creates this kind of power vacuum. If Assad can't rely on Russia as much, who steps in? Who becomes the main power broker? This is where the whole al-Jilani thing gets really interesting.
You mean the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the guy who's been designated a terrorist by the U.S.?
That's the one.
Yeah.
The source suggests that some in the international community, maybe even some in Russia, are starting to see him as a potential alternative to Assad.
Wait, are you serious? A terrorist leader as a viable option?
It sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But remember, international relations is often about pragmatism, not principles. If al-Jilani can successfully rebrand himself, present a convincing case for stability, he might actually gain some traction.
So we're left with this wild scenario, a former terrorist leader, potentially backed by the same powers that once tried to eliminate him, stepping in to fill the void left by Assad.
That's the unsettling reality we're facing, and it speaks to just how unpredictable this whole situation is.
There's definitely this sense of uncertainty, like anything could happen. The source did mention, though, these glimmers of hope, these local communities trying to rebuild their lives amidst all the chaos.
Yeah, that part really resonated with me, too. The women setting up that makeshift school, the doctors and nurses running that clandestine hospital. It shows the incredible resilience of the Syrian people.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Exactly. And it underscores this crucial point.
Yeah.
Any lasting solution in Syria has to come from the Syrian people themselves. It can't be imposed from the outside.
So where does that leave us? What's next for Syria?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I wish I had a crystal ball. But I think the key takeaway here is that the situation is far from over. It's constantly evolving. There are still so many possibilities, both good and bad. And we need to stay engaged, keep learning, keep trying to understand the complexities of this conflict.
It's a call to action, really, to not turn away from the suffering, to stay informed, to support those working for peace and justice.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, the future of Syria, it's not just about geopolitics, it's about people's lives.
We've spent a lot of time unpacking the geopolitical chessboard, but I keep thinking back to those stories of resilience from the source, the doctors, the teachers. It's a stark reminder that amidst all this chaos, there's still hope. There's still life going on.
It's really quite powerful. These aren't just statistics we're talking about. These are real people with incredible strength and determination, rebuilding their lives against all odds.
And it begs the question, what does the future hold for them, for Syria? Can this country ever heal? Can it ever become whole again?
Honestly, that's the million-dollar question. And the source doesn't pretend to have all the answers. But it does offer some interesting food for thought. For instance, it talks about the role of the international community.
Right, because up until now, we've mostly focused on the internal actors, but obviously external forces have played a huge role in shaping this conflict.
Exactly. And the question is, can they also play a role in shaping a peaceful future? Can they help facilitate a Syrian-led solution?
Because a solution imposed from the outside, that's never going to work right. It has to come from within.
I think that's a key takeaway from the source. External powers can provide support, can offer mediation, but ultimately it's the Syrian people who have to decide what their future looks like.
And that future is still so uncertain. We've talked about the possibility of a negotiated settlement, maybe even a power-sharing agreement. But those seem pretty far-fetched at this point.
Yeah, there's so much mistrust, so much animosity. It's hard to imagine those different factions coming together and saying, okay, let's put aside our differences and build a new Syria.
Especially when you've got actors like Turkey and Israel who seem more interested in advancing their own agendas than in promoting peace.
Right. And then there's the wild card, the al-Jilani factor. We talked about how he's trying to reposition himself as a potential leader. But can someone with his baggage really unite the country?
It's a tough sell, isn't it? A former terrorist leader trying to rebrand himself as a unifier.
It's definitely a long shot. But the source points out that stranger things have happened in the world of politics. And if al-Jilani can genuinely convince people that he's changed, that he's committed to peace, well, who knows?
So we're left with a lot of what-ifs. What if Russia completely withdraws its support for Assad? What if al-Jilani gains more power? What if a new faction emerges?
The possibilities are endless. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and so frustrating. It's like trying to predict the weather. You can look at the patterns, you can analyze the data, but you never really know what's going to happen.
It's a reminder that history isn't a straight line. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and often full of surprises.
And I think that's a good place to wrap up this deep dive. Because as much as we've tried to analyze and dissect the Syrian conflict, the truth is we can't predict the future.
But what we can do is stay informed, stay engaged, and continue to seek out diverse perspectives, because only by understanding the complexities of this conflict can we hope to contribute to a more peaceful future for Syria.
Absolutely, and I think that's the key takeaway for our listeners.
Yeah.
Don't turn away from the suffering. Don't give up on hope, and keep asking questions, because those questions, those conversations, they're the first steps towards building a better world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Syrian conflict. It's been a truly eye-opening experience, and I hope our listeners feel the same way.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone listening to keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, never lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
Because ultimately, it's the Syrian people who deserve our attention, our empathy, and our unwavering support.